may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
All right, before we get into this video, I have a very exciting announcement. After an extreme amount of demand, we finally have our Dynasty rankings and tiers posted over there on Patreon. So no, this is not a Dynasty video, what we are going to be talking right now. Well, right now, we are talking about projections for this upcoming 2021 season and what we are going to be doing in our 2021 fantasy football drafts. But for everybody playing Dynasty, y'all know that I consider myself Dynasty centric, and we do have those rankings and those tiers uploaded finally after a very, very long wait. But yeah, other than that, go down there, drop a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive into this video where the first player I want to be talking about is someone that has had a wild offseason. Let's dive into Julio Jones here. Okay, so with Julio Jones, I think that he is easily one of the best values that you can find in fantasy football right now. I mean, you go through and you look at him and you are seeing a massive discount in ADP for pretty much with what you've had in Julio Jones over the past decade. I mean, you just remember Julio over the past 5 to 6 years, and every single season, Julio Jones is being drafted as the top 3 wide receiver. And the reason behind that is very simple. Every single season, Julio Jones has been a top 3 wide receiver for the past 5, 6, 7 years. I mean, it's been ridiculous, the consistency that we've had from Julio Jones and how he's maintained that mark throughout pretty much his entire career without ever seeing a down year at all. Now, you are getting just a price that we have never seen with Julio Jones. He is being drafted as the wide receiver 17, and it's not even as if he saw some massive fall in his ADP after the Tennessee Titans trade, because you go through and you look at where he was going in those high stakes redraft leagues before the Tennessee Titans trade, and then he was valued at the wide receiver 16. So about the same mark. I mean, now he is being valued as a mid wide receiver 2. And there are a few reasons for this. I think one thing that you are going to hear across a lot of analysts is that they believe Julio Jones has seen the fall off, and the Atlanta Falcons are indicating by that trade that they had where they essentially traded him for only a future second round pick. Now, I will say that there's a little bit more that goes into that. Obviously, if Julio Jones was a player on a rookie deal, then getting traded for a second round pick would be very bad. But you have to understand that the Atlanta Falcons aren't necessarily trading Julio Jones just for a second round pick. They are also trading Julio Jones for $17 million at the minimum, because you look at the Julio Jones contract and Julio actually had $17 million on the dead cap. So Atlanta, it's not like they were just getting the draft pick. They were also getting $17 million. So don't view the trade just like that. And I know another narrative that is pushing Julio Jones down draft boards right now is the fact that a lot of people are coming out saying, well, Mason, Julio Jones is always injured. Why am I going to be drafting a wide receiver with one of my first 4 picks if we know that player is going to miss a significant amount of time? Well, guys, I understand that Julio Jones missed 7 games this past year, and it was really just an injury-riddled season overall. But I really want everybody to understand what they are saying with that narrative. I want everybody to understand what they are saying with Julio Jones being a wide receiver that is always injured, always missing time, and that is the reason why you're seeing this discount. Well, I understand he missed 7 games this past season, but you go beyond that, and in 2019, Julio Jones only missed 1 game. 2018, Julio Jones didn't miss a single game at all. 2017, he didn't miss a single game at all. I mean, 2016, he missed 2. 2015, he missed 0. 2014, he only missed 1. So you go through and you account for the past 7 seasons of football. I mean, Julio Jones in the past 7 years has missed a total of 11 games. That is good for Julio Jones missing 1.5 games a season. That is literally nothing in the NFL. I mean, that is nothing at all. The majority of those games coming from a single injury that he suffered this past year. I mean, you can expect Julio Jones probably going to miss about 10% of the season. But you can say that with almost any player in the NFL. So I understand the recency bias with a lot of people wanting to look at that injury with Julio, and they really want to dive into it in a great depth in saying that this is what we should expect going forward. And I find that hard to believe. I always am the person to, instead of focusing on the very small sample, I want to take a step back. I want to try to look at the numbers and use those to make sound decisions. Well, another argument is, well, Mason, Julio Jones was less productive in 2020 than he's been in the past. And I understand, guys, if you pull up right now Julio Jones and his points per game in 2020, it's definitely a step down from what you had throughout his entire career. I mean, in 2020, Julio Jones was actually the wide receiver 13 in points per game. So yeah, I mean, you're not drafting Julio Jones to be the wide receiver 13. If that's the case, obviously that's a pick that you're not going to be excited about last year. But what I really want to focus in on is I want to say, how much of this was due to the injury? How much of this was just due to the fact that maybe Julio Jones at 32 years old isn't the same wide receiver that he was before? So for us to successfully try to evaluate Julio, what I want to do is I want to take out every game that he played less than 50% of the snaps, because we can naturally assume that if Julio Jones was going to play a full slate, if Julio Jones was going to be healthy completely for a game, this is a player playing at the very minimum 80% of the snaps. So if he played less than 50%, you can assume that was a game that he left early. Well, if you take out those 2 games that he left early, Julio Jones was actually the wide receiver 5 in points per game. So Julio Jones was a top 5 wide receiver last year when healthy. The season before that, he was the wide receiver 3 in points per game. The season before that, he was the wide receiver 4 in points per game. So Julio Jones, literally one of the only wide receivers in football. I wish I would have double checked this, but I am almost willing to safely say that Julio Jones, probably the only wide receiver in football that's been top 5 at the position over the past 3 years in points per game while healthy. I mean, that is a mark that you can't overlook. And like we previously stated, Julio Jones right now is being drafted as the wide receiver 17. Julio Jones right now is being drafted as a mid wide receiver 2. Now, it is a little hard to go through and expect a wide receiver at 32 years old to continue to have that elite level of efficiency, because one problem with Julio this upcoming season is he's going over to the Tennessee Titans offense. And with the Titans, you can naturally assume that they're going to be more pass happy with the addition of Julio Jones, given their personnel is most likely going to be significantly better in the passing game this season. But at the same time, you're not expecting them to come close to where the Atlanta Falcons have been over the past few years. So knowing that, what Julio Jones has to do to maintain his mark as a top 5, I don't even want to go as a top 5. Let's just say a top 10 wide receiver in fantasy, because if you draft Julio Jones as the wide receiver 17 and he gives you a top 10 finish, I mean, that is a fantastic draft pick. So what does Julio Jones have to do to hit that mark? Julio Jones has to be an incredibly efficient wide receiver, given the fact that you're going to be expecting A.J. Brown to lead this team in targets. You're not going to be expecting this team to be the 2019 Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where the volume is so high you can have a ridiculous amount of targets for both Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. No, here you need Julio to win with efficiency. So I really want to look at Julio Jones and his efficiency marks over the past 4 years to see if any kind of decline is here. So let's start it in 2017 and 2018, both years where he played a full season, both years where he was in his quote-unquote prime, so we can understand the baseline on what we are expecting with the Julio Jones from his efficiency standpoint. Well, in 2017, he averaged 9.8 yards per target, so obviously near the very top of the NFL. In 2018, 9.9 as well. 2019, he sees a small step back at 8.9, but it's in the range where you understand that this is kind of volatility. I mean, if you continue to see that fall in 2020, that's where we need to throw up the red flag. But no, in 2020 is the complete opposite end of the spectrum, where he averages 11.3 yards per target, a highest mark that we have seen over the past 4 years for Julio Jones. So really, the efficiency isn't falling off at all. I mean, the production isn't falling off. The only thing is, Julio Jones was injured this past year. I mean, that's the only thing that you're seeing a change in other than the offense he's playing in. And I understand it is concerning with Julio Jones leaving Atlanta because, as we previously stated, I mean, the volume is going to be down. You can't necessarily project the Tennessee Titans to be as pass happy as what you've had with the Atlanta Falcons over the past few years. But what we can say is we can go, okay, so if Julio Jones is going to win with efficiency, what do we need? We need elite play, or at least elite efficiency from Ryan Tannehill. So what I want to do is I want to look at the difference between Ryan Tannehill and Matt Ryan, since Tannehill was the quarterback for the Tennessee Titans. So how we are going to evaluate these two players is with adjusted yards per pass attempt. So yards per pass attempt is already a great mark to understand the efficiency of a quarterback, but the problem is it doesn't necessarily take into account for a touchdown. It doesn't necessarily take into account for an interception, because obviously, I mean, if your quarterback's throwing a lot of pass attempts from the 5-yard line, even if he is getting a decent amount of touchdowns with those, I mean, unless you adjust it, it's actually going to be hurting his yards per pass attempt. So it's really nice to go through and look at the adjusted yards per attempt. But anyway, this past season, Matt Ryan was at a 7.4 compared to Ryan Tannehill's 8.7. And in 2019, the difference between the two was even greater, where Matt Ryan was at a 7.1 and Ryan Tannehill was at a 10.2. I mean, so if you go through and average both of these years for the respective quarterbacks, I mean, Matt Ryan had a 7.25 yards per adjusted pass attempt. Ryan Tannehill, on the other hand, had a 9.45. And you do some quick math, and you see that Ryan Tannehill was actually 23% more efficient with his adjusted yards per pass attempt compared to Matt Ryan. That is not a number that you can just overlook. I mean, that is a significant mark. So all of a sudden, you go through the Julio Jones profile going into this season. This is a wide receiver that has been top 5 every single season for the past 3 years in what he is doing when he is healthy. You also look at the situation where, yes, the volume should most likely go down, yet what you're going to find is you're going to find the efficiency to drastically go up with the improved quarterback play for Ryan Tannehill. And then lastly, you know that injuries are at least talked about as being a concern. And we can definitely say Julio Jones has more injury concerns than the average wide receiver in the NFL. That is a fair statement to have. But we can also look at the past 7 seasons from Julio Jones, where he has missed on average 1.5 games a season. That is nothing. So please, if you're going to be getting that massive value, if you can draft him as a low-end wide receiver 2 in fantasy, take Julio Jones every single time. This is a player that has league-winning upside. I mean, he's been a first-round draft pick in fantasy every single season for the past decade. Now is the time to take the discount, take the advantage, because next year, I mean, it's not going to be available when Julio Jones is 33 years old, because I think that is when we'll see the fall off. All right, so now let's get our next wide receiver. And I know we're going to get some hate for this simply because before the NFL draft, I said that I was looking to sell him. I was saying that he was too valuable, especially in dynasty leagues. But this is DJ Chark. Okay, so DJ Chark all of a sudden went from a wide receiver that was being drafted as the wide receiver 29 at the beginning of this offseason in those high-stakes redraft leagues. And I came out and I said, hey, at the wide receiver 29 price, I don't like DJ Chark for the simple fact that this is a team that has a significant amount of cap space this offseason. This is a team that has a significant amount of draft picks this offseason and has a coach and a regime coming in that has no allegiance to the previous players that were already there. So guys like James Robinson and DJ Chark, I didn't want anything to do with. And also, we said whenever the difference between Laviska Shenault and DJ Chark in fantasy drafts was about 4 rounds, that it was laughable and that Laviska Shenault was going to be the wide receiver 1B to DJ Chark's wide receiver 1A, and they needed to be significantly closer in drafts. Well, since then, DJ Chark has had a fantastic offseason. DJ Chark ended up going into free agency and having actually more targets available on his team. I understand they bring in Marvin Jones, but at the end of the video, I will show the target breakdown and how there are going to be more targets available in this offense with so many players leaving. And also, more importantly, instead of this team going and drafting a Rashad Bateman in the first round, instead of them going and getting a Terrace Marshall in the second round, or an Elijah Moore, or any of those wide receivers that we were worried about coming in, instead, they killed James Robinson's value by drafting Travis Etienne. So DJ Chark has that wide receiver 1A role completely saved. And I don't necessarily think that people understand that this has been a good offseason, because all of a sudden, after he goes through and has those marks, because of a few remarks that we've seen from the coaching staff during OTAs, DJ Chark has actually fallen down to be the wide receiver 34 in high stakes redraft leagues. So he is now cheaper after having a very good offseason. And I don't understand that. So I'm actually flipping the script and I'm saying, hey, at the discount, this is when you can buy into DJ Chark, because right now he's going behind Courtland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy, and Juju Smith-Schuster in redraft leagues. I have no idea how that is happening. I mean, who's going to be the quarterback for Courtland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy? Teddy Bridgewater? What? Drew Lock? I mean, I don't even know what to say there. Juju Smith-Schuster is going to have the corpse of Ben Roethlisberger. And y'all know Juju's my guy, but still, DJ Chark going to be significantly better this upcoming season. And here with Chark, if we kind of remember what kind of player he is, I mean, he is just a freak athlete with size. I mean, this is someone that's only 24 years old. He ran a 4.34 40-yard dash. He's 6'3", 199 pounds. Now, if we go through his NFL career, really, there are only 2 seasons to look at, because I want to remind everyone, coming into that 2018 draft class, I mean, DJ Chark was a very raw wide receiver. I mean, this was a prospect that teams were mainly looking at because of his size and athleticism. And they were saying, hey, we're going to have to develop him at the NFL level. He's not ready to play right away. So in 2018, you saw nothing in his rookie season. But his second year in the NFL, in 2019, DJ Chark comes out, averages 7.9 targets a game, 67 receiving yards a game, and has 8 total touchdowns through 15 games. Now, of course, these numbers don't necessarily look like a top 5 wide receiver or anything, but you have to give them some context. You have to understand that Gardner Minshew was the quarterback for this team for 12 games. Nick Foles was the quarterback for this team for 4 games. I mean, that makes a difference, guys. That is going to drastically lower the floor and ceiling combination for this offense. So instead of looking at the raw numbers from DJ Chark, what I would prefer to do is I would rather look at the market numbers and what we saw with DJ Chark in the percent of his team's targets on a per game basis, yards on a per game basis, and passing touchdowns on a per game basis. And DJ Chark actually accounted for 21% of this team's target share. 28% of the passing yards on this offense went to DJ Chark on that per game basis, and 35% of the passing touchdowns. Now, these are elite numbers. I mean, if you're getting a wide receiver that is accumulating 28% of his overall offense's yards, I mean, that is an incredible mark. That is an elite wide receiver mark, just not a low-end wide receiver 1. Now you go to 2020, and I know this was a down year. So here he averages 7 targets a game, 54 receiving yards a game, and he has 5 total touchdowns in 13 games. But somehow, the quarterback play gets even worse in 2020. You only get 9 starts out of Gardner Minshew. You get 5 out of Mike Glennon and 3 out of Jake Luton. I don't think we even have to say much about this. Jake Luton was the quarterback for this team for 3 games. Mike Glennon was the quarterback for this team for 5 games. So those overall numbers for DJ Chark don't mean anything. What matters is going to be the market numbers, where Chark still accounted for 23% of the passing yards on a per game basis, almost 25% of the passing touchdowns. So DJ Chark continues to be the dominant wide receiver in this Jacksonville Jaguars passing offense. And now what I really want to do is look at the fact that I know a lot of people are going to be saying, well, Mason, Laviska Shenault's going to take a step forward, but Mason, Marvin Jones is brought in. Well, if we go to the 2020 target leaders for this team, you have Chark at 1, you have Keelan Cole at 2. Cole is actually gone to New York, so that opens up 88 targets in this offense. Laviska Shenault was 3rd. Chris Conley was 4th with 63. I mean, that's a decent amount of targets. Chris Conley also gone to Houston. So those are 63 more targets available. 5th, you had Tyler Eifert with 60 targets. Well, Tyler Eifert's gone, so that's another 60 targets available. And you had James Robinson with 60 as well. Those targets are going to be going to Travis Etienne. So all of a sudden, you do some quick math and you go, well, there are a ton of targets leaving this offense. Very few players coming in. Only Travis Etienne and Marvin Jones are the additions to this team. So there is room for Laviska Shenault to take that step up. There's room for Travis Etienne to get a significant amount of targets, and still more than enough to go down to DJ Chark, someone who has been consistent over the past 2 years as that alpha target getter in this offense. And if we go back to those market numbers and go, what happens if DJ Chark has a year where he is just halfway between what he was in 2019 and 2020 with the market numbers that he had for this offense? Well, in that case, he is going to account for about 29.8% of the passing touchdowns on a per game basis, a little over 25% of the passing yards. And if we just assume Trevor Lawrence is going to come in and be a league average quarterback, we're going to assume that this team is 16th in passing yards, 16th in passing touchdowns with what we had from 2020 numbers. There, all of a sudden, you do the math with the market numbers that you had from DJ Chark, and this gives him 64 passing yards a game, 8 total touchdowns, and this is right back to his 2019 numbers because you're expecting this offense to get slightly better. And you go back to that 2019 season where DJ Chark was in year 2 of this system. Chark was actually the wide receiver 9 before the injury that he suffered in week 15. In weeks 1 through 14, DJ Chark was the wide receiver 9 on a points per game basis. So now he is being drafted as a wide receiver that is going as almost a high-end wide receiver 4. He is the wide receiver 34 in high-stakes redraft leagues, so a low-end wide receiver 3, a high-end wide receiver 4. We have seen him be a top 10 wide receiver before in the second year in his NFL. He had a great offseason this year with the team really not bringing in anybody you had to worry about. Go get DJ Chark in fantasy drafts. Now, thank you, my dudes. I really hope y'all enjoyed this video. Of course, go down there, drop a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. It helps us out a ton, and I'll see y'all with the video tomorrow. Thank you to everybody supporting the show. We got some new members of the flock in Robert, Caden, Matt, Robbie, Dan, John, Ziggy, Blake, Oliver, and Devin. Thank you, my dudes.